started, even though I know there will be some stragglers and we are still, I think, missing one of our crucial speakers, but the show must go on. There he is. Okay, so we're all here. I am a professor in the history department and the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown, and it was my privilege to work with many of these scholars and authors on this book, The Soviet Gulag, Evidence, Interpretation, and Comparison, which came out recently with Pittsburgh. And I'm just going to say a few words about this project and our sponsors before we get into it. We are, some of you may remember that we had, and some of the authors certainly do, that we had a big Gulag conference here in 2013. So those of you who want to think about how slow the wheels of academic publishing work, the book came out only recently after that. So it's been a very long haul. But this conference in 2013 was to launch a new project here at Georgetown called the Jacques Rossi Memorial Gulag, a research initiative. And that the Jacques Rossi Fund is one of the major sponsors of this event today. We're also very grateful to the CERES program, the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and especially the staff who helped organize this, and the Russian History Seminar of the Georgetown Institute for Global History. But the Jacques Rossi Fund is the main sponsor. Jacques Rossi was a very interesting figure. He was a Polish-French polyglot Comintern agent who was caught up in Stalin's terror in the late 30s and spent 20 years in the Gulag and later became author of many important works, including the Gulag Handbook that was translated into many languages. And he was here at Georgetown. Michelle Sard, my colleague, who's a professor emerita at French, in her book about him, remembers the day that he came into her office to try to get a job teaching French, and she asked him what his qualifications were, and he handed the CV, and from 1937 to 57, he wrote The Soviet Gulag School of Survival. So he was here for a while, and this fund sponsors research related to the Gulag at all levels for undergraduates on, and also events like this. So I should also say that Michelle Sard's wonderful work in French, which was based on many interviews with Jacques Rossi, has been translated now into Russian and into English. Golfo Alexopoulos, who will be our first speaker today, is the editor of this forthcoming volume in English, and she has written an introduction about it. So stay tuned for that book launch, who knows, a couple of years from now probably. So what I'm going to do, so the notion was that we would gather many of the authors and some notable experts on the Gulag from around here to speak not about their own chapters in this book, but to stand back a little bit and reflect on the book as a whole, on the state of Gulag research, and really anything else they want to talk about. And each speaker will have 5 to 10 minutes. I've said maximum of 10 minutes, but since we have many speakers, and I know we want to have a discussion afterwards, if you want to go for 5 or 7, perfectly okay with me. And I'll hold back until the end and see how we're doing on time. But I'll briefly introduce the speakers before they speak. And our first speaker, as I've said, is Golfo Alexopoulos. She's professor of history, and she just told me she's the director of a new Institute on Russia, which has just been founded at the University of South Florida. So that's great news. Her first book was called Stalin's Outcasts, Aliens, Citizens, and the Soviet State, 1926-1936. She was a co-editor of a book about her mentor called Writing the Stalin Era, Sheila Fitzpatrick and Soviet Historiography. She's published many important articles on the Gulag, and most recently a major book on Gulag medicine that just came out with Yale University Press called Illness and Inhumanity in Stalin's Gulag. So also, I'm going to ask the speakers to come up here because we're filming this for our podcast. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you all for being here. I just want to mention that one of the wonderful features of this book is that it elaborates on something that Jacques Rossi mentions in his work. And Jacques characterized the Gulag as a stratistan, and a place with many layers and strata. And I think what this book really brings out is the fact that we can't generalize about the Gulag very much anymore. We know that there were hundreds of camps. We know that there were camps and colonies, and the colonies were very different from some of the major camps. Each camp was a complex of smaller units. So it's probably fair to say that the Gulag consisted of thousands of camp sections. And what our colleague Oleg Khlyavnyuk brings out in his work in the book is that the Gulag and the non-Gulag worlds in certain strata, in certain areas, the most benevolent parts of the Gulag and the most cruel parts of the non-Gulag world, were similar in some ways. And so it's time for us to think about this thread, or these gradations of terror and forced labor and punishment. What I try to do in my work is to bring out the kind of first circle of the Gulag, the worst, the area where the Gulag was the most severe and the most violent. And that's the area of food distribution and physical exploitation, the system of physical exploitation. But people were exploited in many different ways, as this book reveals. They were exploited for their intellect and for their skills. They were exploited sexually. So there were the range, again, of exploitation, the range of violence, is something that I think this book really brings out, and I think that's the next direction of Gulag studies, is to say, okay, we've generalized enough. The Gulag is X, the Gulag is Y. Now it's time to go deeper and look at the granular level. Why is it that in this camp was more deadly than this other camp? On the subject of deadliness and extreme violence, up until the point of this book's publication, the most violent moments of the Gulag tended to be characterized temporally. So we said, well, the late 30s was a really bad time, or the early 30s, or the war was a really bad time. But again, in this kind of spirit of breaking down the Gulag and examining its pieces and its strata more closely, I think it's important to say, well, in the colonies, it was the most violent. The colonies in Central Asia were particularly gruesome, worse in some ways than the camps in Norilsk. So what I would just offer and summarize here in 5 minutes is simply to say that what I consider the great contribution of this book and the general direction of the field, I believe, is now sort of looking more closely, moving away from these sort of big generalities about all the time the Gulag was X, and looking more closely at some of the variations and the degree to which different levels of the penal system under Stalin varied. Now, I say this as somebody who just wrote a book and said the Gulag is X. And what I tried to do is to say that in this sort of first circle of violence, which I believe has to do with human exploitation, the way that food was distributed, and so on. I think that was system-wide, and so I just want to leave you with this point, that while we do want to look at the granular differences and the strata and the diversity and variation and range of cruelty that existed across various camps, it is important to keep in mind that this was a system, and this was a very centralized system in many ways. And as such, different elements of the system did have to comply with the basic rules of the Gulag, many of which, especially as these related to physical exploitation, were quite violent, inhumane, and in some ways even genocidal. But I will leave the G word out for now. Okay, next.
Thank you, Golfa. So we're going from alphabetical order. We're going from A to B, and we have three people whose name starts with B, so we're going to the B.A., Steve Barnes. Steve Barnes, one point that I want to make is that many of the archives relating to the Gulag were closed before 1991. Solzhenitsyn's great opus, the Gulag Archipelago, was published in the 70s, but the wave of historical research on the Gulag only really started to appear not immediately after 91, with a little bit of a lag in the 2000s, and so Steve Barnes is something of an eminence grise in this new literature in a way, because his book Death and Redemption, The Gulag and the Shaping of Soviet Society, was published in 2011. He was not a part of our collected volume, but he is one of the specialists on the Gulag whose work has sort of been path-breaking. And by the way, so despite the rather young demeanor of my colleagues here, this is a collection of people who are on the cutting edge of research on the Gulag as the new literature has been developed. So Steve's work won the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize from the American Historical Association, along with other honors. He has also done a lot of work as a consultant, for example, for a traveling museum exhibit on the history of the Gulag. He teaches at George Mason University here in the Washington area, where he's an associate professor, and he works with their Center for New Media on a website which you can it's called Gulag Many Days, Many Lives. You can look it up on gulaghistory.org. He has a great new book project called Gulag Wives, Women, Family, and Survival in Stalin's Terror.
I'm trying to think that gray eminence thing isn't about my hair, but I'm not so sure. So actually, I got to thinking about it as I was thinking about what I would say today. It's been about 20 years now since I was a graduate student and wrote my first really, really cruddy graduate student paper about the history of the Gulag. And it gives me a moment to just pause and reflect on sort of where we've come and what I think this book represents. When I was a grad student in 1997 and first started really reading about this stuff, the archives were open, but as Misha kind of indicated, there wasn't a lot that had been done yet. Most of the work that was being done at that point was focused around the issue of numbers. How many prisoners were there? How many died? These kinds of things. A lot of debates taking place around those issues. There were studies starting to emerge in Russia and in other parts of the former Soviet Union at that time, some local scholars doing really great work. But they were, at that point, mostly hewing very, very close to the documents. There was very little effort or concern at that time over what the newly emerging information actually meant about our interpretation for the function, the meaning, the significance of the Gulag in Soviet history. We had obviously a very important moment in terms of public knowledge of the Gulag in 2003 when Anne Applebaum published her Pulitzer Prize winning book, Gulag: A History. But I would say that too. It was a book that was sort of Solzhenitsyn updated. It didn't add a lot to our interpretive framework and how we think about the Gulag. It only really has a smattering of archival information included within it. But it was about this time that graduate students and scholars were combing through the archives with interpretive issues at the forefront of their minds. And I think this volume is really, in many respects, the result of that work as it has grown and grown. So whereas I went from 1997 having a hard time finding good work to look at, in 2006 I ran a 4-day conference at Harvard on the history and legacy of the Gulag and had over 70 applications from scholars looking to take part. And so it was clear already that Gulag studies were emerging quite significantly. I had a notion of doing a volume that might have looked something like this at the time. Some personal issues got in the way. It never got done. I'm kind of glad in a way because I think what Misha has done here is better and more interesting, and I'll talk about a couple of those reasons why. That conference was interdisciplinary to a much greater degree than what I think we see here. I had a lot of literature scholars involved, other people looking at ways in which the Gulag reverberated in Russian culture, but it didn't have this comparative component. And I find that really, really interesting in what's here. We have some very well-chosen topics put together very nicely by a scholar who is, I think, quite noted for his ability to bring together authors. The conference was terrific. I was at it, even though I did not present anything during the conference, but it was such stimulating discussion. There's an excellent editorial overview in this volume that Michael David Fox wrote, one of the great historiographical essay writers in our field. And I was really glad to see his take on a lot of issues, and he raises, I think, a lot of important questions for us still going forward. And so it's well worth spending some time with it and thinking about it. But it's the comparative section that I find, in some ways, the most interesting, the most unusual. And maybe that's because I've known the work of all of these scholars for so long. We've participated in conferences together and on panels together and things of that sort. The comparative section, even though many of us have always had comparative issues in our minds as we have thought about these topics, it's not usually taken a very sort of clear and intense form in our own scholarship. I mean, I think, I personally have taught history courses on the global history of the concentration camps since I was a grad student in the late 90s. But few have really directly engaged the comparison in their writing beyond the Nazi-Soviet comparison. I think there's actually even ways that this comparative angle could be pushed further. Jeff Hardy, who is at BYU and who's one of the towering figures in our field of Gulag studies and who's not in this book, has written elsewhere putting the Gulag in the comparative framework of modern penal systems. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, and whether the concentration camp is the right way to think about this in a comparative framework. I think you learn a lot out of all of these various comparisons. Anyway, there are a lot of things left to do in the field, and it's exciting to see how many people are working on it and doing such great things. I stayed in the field. I swear to God, as soon as I wrote the Gulag book, I was getting out of this business. But it feels like there's so many things that we still need to know. Just one of many challenges, and I'm not going to stand up here and tell these folks, what the things are that we need to do. It's the challenge that I've been working on is thinking about how we now rework the individual prisoner experience back into our histories. To take that seriously again, if we look at, as some of these authors do, if we look at the metaphor of the Gulag as an archipelago and find problems with it, because the Gulag and its institutions were so integrated into the local communities, integrated into the Soviet Union at large, what do we make of the fact that the prisoner experience is profoundly one of geographic separation and one of experiencing that life as having been removed from the mainland? So I think it's worth thinking about that, but there are many other things. It was a wonderful moment, I think, in Gulag studies to see it really emerge in this kind of way as a field, and I urge you all to spend some time with this book.
Thank you. So speaking of comparisons, 7, I think, of the 12 chapters, or at least 7, were dealt with comparisons of one kind or another. And 2 of them were not geographical comparisons, but temporal comparisons. We had Daniel Beer, who is our next speaker, is an expert on the Tsarist exile system. So the way that exile and Tsarist penal system, in a way, set the stage and led to certain long-standing continuities, was part of this book and was complemented by a chapter by Judith Pallo, a British scholar who works on the post-Soviet penal system, where many of the prisons and some of the practices are continuous, not with just the Soviet, but with the Tsarist period. Daniel Beer is Reader in Modern European History at Royal Holloway College at the University of London. His major field is Imperial and especially late Imperial Russian history, but his first book actually went on both sides of 1917. It was called Renovating Russia, the Human Sciences and the Fate of Liberal Modernity, 1880 to 1930. He has just published, and you will see many of these books that our authors are publishing are just coming out now. The House of the Dead, Siberian Exile Under the Tsars, which came out this year and was shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize in History in the UK. It's on the 2017 long list for the Cundill History Prize in Canada. So, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Steve hasn't shot my fox dead, but it's definitely limping. So I'm also going to. So I'm not a scholar of the Gulag, and so I sort of stand here with some trepidation, offering opinions about a book devoted to its study. But for someone positioned on the margins of the field, I think also I agree with Steve. I think one of the great contributions that this book makes is its comparative framework, or what Michael refers to in his introduction as its instructive sort of juxtapositions of case studies. And of course, although there is this sort of established, perhaps rather too established, comparison of the Nazi and Stalinist camp regimes, I think this volume breaks new ground in exploring a comparative dimension which ranges much more widely, both spatially and temporally. So not just my chapter and Judy Pallo's, but also Aidan's chapter on the British experience in the 19th century. And I think that's so I think these genealogies, which sort of range over time, not only across the territories of the former Soviet Union and Tsarist Empire, but also far beyond them, point to what Aidan, I think, in his own contribution calls family resemblances between different carceral regimes in other states and at other times. And I think that they point the way forwards to, sort of very interesting avenues of new research. So I suppose just what I took away from the book was it sort of raised very interesting questions for me about the kind of penal imagination that the Bolsheviks inherit. I mean, not just from their immediate Tsarist predecessors, but from an engagement which is alluded to in some of the contributions, their engagement with the penal regimes of contemporary states, in the 19th and early 20th century, and I think that it's intriguing to think about the way in which that sort of intellectual or cultural debt, some of which is explored very ably by Judy Pallo in her article, can lead us to kind of rethink, the intellectual, the cultural origins of the Gulag, and also its own subsequent influence and sort of reverberation beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. And I guess the question which is inevitably that comparative dimension inevitably pose is, well, what's specific or distinctive or relatively distinctive about the Gulag? What sets it apart, and to what degree from penal regimes elsewhere? And I'll mention a couple of things which struck me. I mean, I think perhaps these are broader questions for discussion. But it seems to me that whereas other camp regimes or other penal regimes seek to cleanse an established society of unwanted elements by confining them, disciplining them, placing them behind barbed wire and so on, what stands out about the Tsarist, but especially the Soviet penal system, is the attempt to deploy convict labour in the service of a grand project of internal colonization. So this is an attempt to use prisoners to populate and exploit natural resources of a periphery. I mean, however elastic and unstable that term might be. And I think that's one of the reasons why what seems to be so central to the experience of the Gulag is, again, something that Steve has already alluded to, which is this idea of migration, of separation, of being uprooted. And Judy Pallow's contribution makes clear that this persists today in Russia as a defining feature of the penal system, even if the actual practical application of that kind of colonial ambition has now been sort of displaced by what I think she terms a kind of a culture of punishment, which embraces the use of distance as a way of punishing convicts. Another theme which I think comes out in a lot of the essays is that of a kind of undergoverned space, that the Gulag remains in crucial respects an undergoverned space. The centre remains dependent on unreliable subordinate agents, whether they are under-resourced, corrupt, recalcitrant officials who are ignoring Moscow's edicts, or whether they are also dependent on the vagaries of the convict's own self-governance to make the system work. So I think that the volume points to this tension between, on the one hand, the state's sort of soaring colonial disciplinary ambitions, sort of Zygmunt Bauman's gardening state, sort of high modernist ambitions on the one hand, and then it's the relative weakness of state power, which is highlighted in its kind of improvised and negotiable nature in territories that are distant from or sort of inaccessible to central oversight and control. So for me, as someone who sort of stands very much on the margins of this field, I think one of the great strengths of this fascinating collection of essays, and I can again add my chorus, my voice to the chorus of approval of Michael's wonderful introduction, which manages to stitch these essays together with a kind of coherence that I think is really quite remarkable. Is that it positions the study of the Gulag within a much wider spatial and temporal framework, and that framework raises important questions about the organisation, the operation, the influence of the Gulag, but it also inevitably speaks to scholars of other penal systems in other states at other times. Thank you.
So we heard at the beginning from Golfo Alexopoulos that the Gulag is made up of thousands of different units, many of which are extremely varied, and yet there was a unified administration and a certain coherence to the entire monstrosity. And we've also just heard from Daniel Beer that the Gulag had many functions. There was both penal incarceration, it was political prisoners, it was forced labor and an integral part of forced industrialization and the Stalinist planned economy, and had this whole function of settling the far north and distant regions, and other functions as well. And so as we're grappling with this, Wilson Bell, our next speaker, has focused on, in his chapter here and in his forthcoming book on especially the economic dimension. Wilson is assistant professor of history and politics at Thompson Rivers University in British Columbia, Canada. He's written several very important articles on the Gulag in places like the Russian Review. I particularly remember his one on Solzhenitsyn's metaphor of the archipelago and questioning whether it was really applicable to something that was, we'll talk about that presently. But he's also just completed his own book, manuscript, Stalin's Gulag at War, Forced Labor, Mass Death, and Soviet Victory in World War II, focusing especially on the Siberian camp system. And he's just told me that it's forthcoming at the University of Toronto Press. Awesome.
So thank you all who are here, and thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Jacques Rossi Fund as well. It was a real pleasure to be part of this conference a few years ago, and I'm delighted to be back here again. I must say most of the points I had intended to make have been made already about the book. Now, I started researching for my dissertation. I guess I started the research for it probably in 2004, so the wheels of academic life do move slowly. And at that time, I had a similar, in a way, a similar reaction to Steve Barnes. There wasn't a lot that had been published, and so to me, I think what this book represents is a real kind of maturity of Gulag studies as a discipline. It's the first real anthology of academic works, history focused on the Gulag. It covers it from a variety of perspectives. Everything from, indeed, there's almost 2 chapters on medicine in the camps, which was an almost completely neglected area of Gulag studies before this book came out. But everything to that, to the Gulag at War, to the special settlements, which have been, more or less integrated into Gulag studies. These were exile settlements for peasants. To also this broader comparative perspective. So I think what we see with this book is Gulag studies almost as an official subfield, I suppose, of Soviet studies more broadly. One thing I really appreciate about the book, and this is to echo what some of my colleagues have said, but is this comparative element. And I was rereading the book in preparation for this event, and comparison is nice for situating this camp the camp system in a broader framework, but it's also helpful for then reflecting back on what the Gulag is and what it isn't. And I think the comparative essays in the volume are very helpful for this. So for example, Daniel Beer's article, which focuses mostly on actually the movement of exiles across Siberia as part of this punishment system in the late CERES period, right? I see some similarities there with my own research on the Gulag, where, for instance, he mentions that ill prisoners often stopped in Tomsk, and this also happened during the Soviet period, where sick and disabled prisoners often stopped in Western Siberia rather than going on to some of the more priority camps like those in Kolyma. So that's a similarity. But then his article also made me think, well, we don't really have much scholarship on the actual transport of prisoners in the Gulag. I mean, that's one area that is significantly lacking, even though certainly a lot of memoirists talk about it. And I was struck with some of the other articles as well. So the article on the North Korean camps, which was something I was, completely unaware of in an academic sense, right? It was interesting to see how these camps get their start, are motivated in some ways by the Gulag and Soviet advisors. But then they take on a completely different trajectory that has a lot to do with North Korean culture generally. So it's sort of interesting to see then, reflecting back on the Gulag, kind of what it is and what it isn't. And I'll echo the kind of room too for comparison in terms of looking at other penal systems, whereas most of these articles focus on concentration camps. We have had the term Gulag used for a huge variety of institutions at various times. There's a book on, I think, called The Golden Gulag about California's penal system, for example. So there might be room for some interesting comparisons there. Again, both to highlight maybe some of the key similarities, but also important differences. So thank you very much.
Yeah, in retrospect, if I knew what I knew today, perhaps the book would not only have the different country comparisons with camp systems, because as has been said, the Gulag had both what was referred to in the 30s, the camp principle became predominant in the late 30s, but the special settlements, and Wilson's mentor at Toronto, Lynn Viola's book on the special settlers who were victims of dekulakization during the early 1930 era, right around circa 1930, the first wave, was translated into Russian not as the unknown Gulag, which he published about in English, but as the peasant Gulag. And so settlements, as well as penal systems, and not just camps, are very relevant for comparison. This book had comparisons with the Nazi German case, but not just the extermination camps, but also the Nazi labor camps, which gives it a different valence. And it had a Chinese Laogai re-education camp system, the North Korean case. And the most interesting of all, I think, relates to our next speaker, Aidan Forth, who is a very intrepid interloper here among us Russianists, because he's a British historian who works on the British example throughout the 19th and early 20th century in India and Africa. He's an assistant professor at Loyola University in Chicago, and he has a strong interest in the comparative history of camps. His book, again, just came out, The Barbed Wire Imperialism, Britain's Empire of Concentration Camps, 1876, 1903. Is it actually there? Because yes, on Amazon it said when I just ordered my advanced copy, it was still not quite published. So literally coming out here at this event. It's out in hardcover and paperback from the University of California Press. And I excerpt this from the description. Quote, it situates the concentration and refugee camps of the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, within longer traditions of controlling the urban poor in metropolitan Britain and managing suspect populations in the empire. The reason why we picked his chapter especially was because it comes not from a communist or a fascist regime, but from what he calls a liberal empire. The British camps were artifacts of liberal empire that inspired and legitimized the practices of future regimes. That's from the blurb. And the epilogue of his book, which I'm very much looking forward to reading, is called Camps Go Global, Legacies, Lessons, and Forgotten Solidarities. So, Abe.
Well, thank you very much for having me here as an outsider. And to make up for my lack of knowledge about the Gulag, I will show you some pictures. as well. I guess, my way of looking at this is the opposite to golfers, who I think it's really important to get down to that granular level. But for me, I think, again, one of the payoffs of this book, to echo others, is its transnational and its comparative scope. The juxtaposition of multiple camp regimes, I think, helps us to understand the Gulag better. It helps us to determine what is unique to the Soviet case and what are the shared elements of a broader culture of confinement that really spans the globe in the 19th and the 20th centuries. We have, of course, the great article on the comparison to the diverse Nazi empire of camps in the 20th century. I'm excited to see comparisons to Chinese and North Korean labor camps as well, which highlight a process of transnational learning and conscious emulation. We see how influential the Gulag is as a model, even as camps in East Asia adopt their own kind of cultural and Confucian inflections. My own work on liberal empire, I think, kind of pushes comparison in another direction in ways that I hope will force us to acknowledge some unexpected, sometimes unsettling likenesses, while also forcing us to draw some important historical and moral distinctions. One of the things that I am interested in is kind of pushing back against old Cold War assumptions that there's some absolute dichotomy between East and West, between capitalism and communism, between the so-called free world and the communist bloc. As a historian of Britain, I, of course, study an empire that claimed to be commercial, maritime, and free. And yet, as I read the chapters of this book, I do see some familiar themes. As I argue in my own monograph, which I can sell you a copy, but I don't want to detract from this book launch, is that Britain, of course, was the first to use so-called concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War. It went on to create what Caroline Elkins refers to as Britain's Imperial Gulag in Kenya, a pipeline of political prisoner camps in the 1950s. Britain also presided over work camps in India for so-called criminal tribes, and it erected famine relief camps in India as well, which ostensibly were humanitarian institutions, but which nonetheless synthesize and experiment with some pretty disturbing forms of bodily coercion. The official rations at these camps, the penal ration anyway, was a mere 670 calories a day. That, coupled with a regime of heavy labor, leads to the destruction of human life on a mass scale. If this could happen at an institution, a so-called relief camp meant to save life, at the hands of an empire with as robust a liberal and humanitarian tradition as Britain, it's no surprise to me whatsoever that we see this destructive labor happen in the camps that golfers are interested in. Another theme in this book is the employment of spatial distance as a form of punishment. We see this in the contributions by Daniel Beer and also by Judith Pellow. This also is a familiar dynamic to a historian of Britain. Britain differs from the Soviet Union, of course, because it doesn't have these vast hinterlands in Siberia. So when Britain wanted to get rid of its unwanted social and political elements, it had to instead send them overseas to penal colonies in America and then especially in Australia. This was the way to dispose of the criminal classes as well as political prisoners, particularly Irish Republicans, pro-French radicals, and so on, throughout the 19th century. This system largely comes to an end in the 1860s, partly because of Australian self-rule, partly because of kind of Benthamite prison reform, and so on. But it continues in other places. In India, for example, the Andaman Islands, in a remote area of the Indian Ocean, this remains a site of exile and servitude for Indian political prisoners into the 20th century. And this was a particularly horrifying system for Hindus because travel across the ocean entailed a loss of caste, a type of sort of civil or social death. And so the British, like the Bolsheviks, employ spatial distance as sort of a conscious form of terror. Another theme in the book that I found interesting was this dynamic between free and unfree labor. I think we all recognize that Western democracies have a long tradition of unfree labor, and most of Georgetown was built by slaves. And we also find that in imperial spaces in the 19th and into the 20th centuries that lacked a free wage labor force, a labor force disciplined by the cashnexes, we find that infrastructure projects, development projects largely depend on various forms of coerced labor. This included, among other things, the Buckingham Canal in India, which was built by convicts, indentured workers, as well as famine relief labor. And one thing I'd just point out is that I think that public works departments from Britain and from other Western empires are really important here in forging new techniques of billeting mass populations in mobile work camps. And actually something that I think still needs to be explored is that there may be a British contribution to the Soviet Union that we haven't recognized, because in the 1921 famine, Britain sent public works officials from India to advise on Russian famine relief. Whether any of this sort of experience went on to inform logistical arrangements of the White Sea Canal, I don't know. It would be a fascinating topic to explore. And then finally, let me just conclude with another comparison. It's one that both Steve and Wilson alluded to, but let me kind of lay it out a little bit more systematically. It's a comparison made in the media lot. It's a comparison that I think needs some sober and some serious academic reflection too. And that, of course, is to America's own prison industrial complex today. This is a system certainly that's constrained by the rule of law, that's constrained by constitutional safeguards. It's also, however, a system that has generated what Sheriff Joe Arpaio himself refers to as a concentration camp in the Sonora Desert, one that targets specific categories of the population according to the politics of race and immigration. And much like the Gulag, America's for-profit prison system increasingly is playing an economic role. An underclass of Latino immigrants, African-American youth are inscribed into a system of cheap, exploitable, forced labor. Unfree labor constitutes 1% of the U.S. workforce today. 1 in 3 African-American men end up as unfree workers at some point in their lives. They are the prisoners of a criminal justice system that services private rather than communal property. And much as the Gulag appropriated CERES systems of servitude, I think there's a clear continuity between this new form of unfree labor and histories of slavery. It is the 13th Amendment, in fact, that specifically legalizes forced penal labor. So, I don't mean to draw any facile connections here. I don't mean to suggest that America is like the Soviet Union. To the contrary, I think one of the payoffs of comparison is that by pointing out similarities, we're also forced to better isolate fundamental differences, not least of which is we have an open civil society. Hopefully no one's going to arrest me at the end of this talk and take me to Siberia. Private for-profit elements obviously inform American practices, ideological, sort of authoritarian state planning, an ideological adherence to Bolshevism informs of Soviet practice. But at the same time, the larger point here is simply that, as this book shows, the Gulag was not an isolated or an exceptional phenomenon. It's rather the outgrowth of larger global trends that develop in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Soviet Union synthesizes all of these elements in different ways, but the basic ingredients of the Gulag, mass incarceration, economic rationalization, ideologies of work as punitive and rehabilitative, fears of social and political danger and contagion, these are all widely shared across the world. They're not unique to the Soviet Union. So in that way, I think the Gulag is of more than academic interest, and it's of more than simply the interest of academics who study the Soviet Union. I think it has larger lessons and larger implications for other systems of penal servitude. Thank you so much. Try to close that.
Thank you. Yeah, on reflection, I should have invited our colleague Mark Howard, who just wrote a book called Unusually Cruel, that's getting a lot of play about, he's associated with government and department and the law school here. But it has to do with the real American exceptionalism, by which he means industrialized countries today, not historically. Historically, the Gulag is associated especially with the Stalin period. There were early Soviet camps before that. There was the Red Terror and the Civil War. But the Gulag as a mass system of both forced labor and a network of camps as such was founded right after Stalin assumed sole power in the late 1920s. And millions of people were emptied out of the camps after the Stalin period ended in the 1950s. So our next speaker is without exaggeration, one of the world's greatest experts on Stalinism, David Shearer, who is professor of history at the University of Delaware. He's author of Industry, State, and Society in Stalin's Russia, 1926-1934. Another book, Policing Stalin's Socialism, Social Order and Mass Repression in the Soviet Union, 1924-1953. A co-authored work with Vladimir Khaustov, which is more recent, called Stalin and the Lubyanka, a documentary history of the political police and security organs in the Soviet Union, 1922-1953. And he also, in a way, took part in this book. He was not one of the authors of the chapters, but he wrote the blurb on the back and the preface.
The most important thing.
Daniel, I think that my fox is not only dead, but it's been shot 5 or 6 times already. I'm certain that I'm not the first, and certainly won't be the last, to congratulate Michael and all the authors in this collection. There is, as I'm sure most of you know, an enormous literature on the Soviet Gulag and the Soviet incarceration system. And each one, of course, claims to be breaking new ground. But this book really does stand out, I think, and it does so for at least several reasons. The most important reason, of course, the thing that makes the book the most significant, is my stunningly brilliant 2.5 page preface. So but other than that, I think first, no one, if people had not read, certainly hadn't read Wilson Bell's article, certainly no one can come away from this book and still accept Solzhenitsyn's metaphor of the Gulag system as an isolated system of islands within Soviet society. Nearly every essay in this book stresses the interaction between the Gulag and the society of which it was a part. Bettina, of course, writes about this in her comment, as does Michael, when she refers to the Gulag as an incarnation of the state that created it. The camps were only the most extreme manifestation of a coercive state system that encompassed the whole of Soviet society. Different authors over the several years have used different metaphors to describe this interaction: revolving doors, porous boundaries, stratifications, continuums, gulag, ni-gulag, but all emphasize the Gulag system as a constitutive part of both the Soviet state and of Soviet society. The second reason this book stands out has to do with its comparative dimension, of course, and almost everybody has mentioned that, so I won't belabor that point very much, but it's clear from the comparisons in this book, it's clear that while the Soviet Union may have had the most extensive mass incarceration system, it was by no means unique. Even in its repressive policies, the USSR was part of a system of modern state development. There, Michael, I said the M word, modernity. I had thought that the modernity neo-traditional debate about the Soviet Union was long behind us until Michael had to go and resurrect it from the dead, and did so in an award-winning book, no less. And of course, this comes up again especially in these comparisons about whether or not the Soviet Union was modern or not modern. So was the Soviet Union modern? Well, of course it was. It was born out of a modern industrial war. It was underpinned by a modern emancipatory ideology, and it was created in an era we identify as the modern era. Was it also characterized by neo-traditional institutions, the other side of the debate? Yes, of course it was. Patronage networks, social, geographic corporatism, the distancing that's discussed by Aiden and by others as a form of social terror. The point here is that it seems to me that both the modernity advocates and the neo-traditionalists are correct. But the problem is they're talking past one another. The one side, the modernity side, it seems to me, is talking about intentions. The other side is talking about consequences or actual practices. This is an interesting debate, but probably unresolvable. Although I must say that while I consider the Soviet state a modern state, I don't think of it modern for many of the same reasons that the modernity advocates cite. Or rather, I should say that I don't find the characteristics they ascribe to modernity as particularly modern, especially when we're talking about a system like the Gulag system. Techniques of systematic and prophylactic social interaction or intervention, goals of sculpting and molding, social improvement, these, in my view, are not particularly peculiar to the 19th and 20th centuries. The same technologies and goals of social sculpting we can find at work in numerous historical examples. Just to mention a couple, we can go back to late 15th century Spain and the expulsion of the Jews from that kingdom, and then in the 17th century, the expulsion of the Moriscos, the Muslim populations from Spain. And not just practicing Muslims, but descendants of Muslims that had been Christianized. Those mass expulsions were a planned prophylactic measure to purge and protect the religious and political body of the Spanish kingdom. So if we're going to debate the modernity or lack of it in the context of the Soviet Union or in the context of the Gulag system, we need to confront the issue of modernity itself. The concept of modernity seems to me is like Marx's description of modernity itself. When you try to pin it down, it seems to melt into air. One other thing that this book does, in my mind, is to lay to rest the idea of the Gulag as a place of rehabilitation, or as they say, reforging, or Perikovka. Steve, I guess we're going to have a discussion about this. If this notion ever existed, it seems to me it did so mainly in the fantasies of some self-aggrandizing intellectuals. But I don't think that any policeman or camp commandant believed in it. Yagoda, the head of the political police for much of the 1930s, certainly didn't believe in it. Neither did his successor, Nikolai Yezhov. It's very clear from both their policies and their statements. If the idea had any life at all, it was short-lived and was certainly dead by 1935. In that year came Yagoda's order to restrict released exiles to their place of exile. In that same year, the Council of People's Commissars resolved to end the use of the phrase for sentencing of criminals and exiles and other people, to end the use of the phrase measures of social defense, меры социальной защитности. which they had been using since the 1920s. In their resolution, they noted that no one understood what that meant. And so they revived the original Russian imperial term nakazania, punishment. And they noted that people understand what that means. And it's certainly not Perikovka. Finally, and in sum, it seems to me that this book is significant because it does two seemingly contradictory things. It both consolidates a new view of the Gulag within Soviet society, and at the same time, it opens up new avenues in two directions, as numerous people have noted, in comparative work and also in the detail of the daily lives of the different camps and what they were like and how they differed. So this is, to my mind, a remarkable book. I think it will sort of establish the landmark for research for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. We're getting to the end of the essays now. Kathleen Smith, certainly not least. She's our very own professor of post-communist studies and so much more here at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies at Georgetown. She's author of Remembering Stalin's Victims, Popular Memory and the End, Remembering Stalin's Victims, Popular Memory and the End of the USSR, another study called Myth-Making in the New Russia, and just this year, Moscow 1956, The Silenced Spring. Okay?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, patient audience. It's very nice of you to include a non-historian here at the end. We'll see if we can put a little more contemporary connection into our discussion today. So I just want to bring to your attention that in just over 2 weeks, there's going to be the opening of a new monument in Moscow, a national monument to victims of repression. Rumor has it that Vladimir Putin is going to speak at this event, which will be something since he normally does not do much towards commemorating the victims of repression. This is exciting to me as a political scientist who studied collective memory and popular politics for a long time. But it also has this connection with the volume today because so I recently wrote an article, which we might see in a year or 5 at this rate, about the competition for the monument and the difficulty that the designers and architects had in trying to distill the experience of repression in Russia into a visual format. And this is something that the Russian scholar Alexander Etkin has written about, that memory in Russia, he finds, expresses itself more in texts, what he calls the software, than in hardware like monuments. So I was really excited that this volume has an expansion of an article by Aglaya Glebova from the Kritika Journal that looks specifically at visual history of the Gulag. And I thought I would take Glebova's article, especially since she's not here today, and therefore I can take over her subject just a little bit, as a jumping off point, not only to say that this is a very worthwhile volume, but also to remind us of all the things yet to be done in Gulag studies. So she looks specifically at the incomplete photographic record of the Gulag. And I would say that her theses about picturing the Gulag are a great jumping off point for thinking about how we can use other visual forms and also to think about the impact of the Gulag on Russian society today, because this incomplete visual documentary record, I think, influences the way that the Gulag is still being fought over in current memory wars. So Glebova has 9 theses. I won't hit you with them all, but I will note that she points out first and foremost that the documentary photography of the Gulag is very sanitized. We don't have pictures of atrocities. It's also a very incomplete record, not only because we're missing certain aspects of the Gulag, but also because the Gulag and photography combined in a different way, that is in the erasure of photographs of people from photographs. Most famously, David King has a whole volume called The Commissar Vanishes that looks at this phenomenon. But so often photography of the Gulag was not about creating a new record, but about erasing people and with them some memories. Anyway, Glebova reflects on the intermingling of propaganda photos with the very banal and mundane images, such as the mugshots that were taken upon arrest. And she also draws our attention to how surviving photographic record of the Gulag has been framed by archivists or people who use these photos, who placed them in albums, surrounded them with texts, and gave them a textual format. So she points out these many problems, and it makes me, itch to get at other visual records. And so you should buy this book, but you should also read more. And I thought I would take this moment to just briefly push 2 books that I reviewed for Critica this summer about the Gulag, each of which has its own heavy reliance on visuals, but not on the historical documentary photography that Glebova writes about. The first one is a book of fathers' letters from the Gulag to their children that was published by Memorial in Russian. So you might think that a book of letters would be very textual, but in fact, this book is gorgeous. It's hard to say a beautiful book about the Gulag. It's a beautiful book. It has watercolors, drawings, etc. And these are not just little happy pictures for children and letters about how I miss you. I was pleasantly surprised to find in this book, I had to write this down, there were so many images, scale maps of prison compounds, detailed drawings of barracks, landscapes, illustrations of flora and fauna, maps of travel from places of exile deeper into Siberia, portraits of fellow prisoners, and so forth. So these 2 don't show much of the atrocities of the Gulag. There is post-Gulag artworks that do deal with that. But I would say that this gives us a flipped perspective. These are the prisoners choosing and selecting images, admittedly for a very specific audience, but I think they're deserving of more study. And this is really a document collection and not an analysis. The second book that I looked at is called Article 58, The Uneliminated. It's by 2 journalists from Novaya Gazeta, and it's based on interviews with camp prisoners and also people who worked in the penal system. And the visual aspect of it is that the photographer not only made for each interview a photograph of the elderly person, because these are recent interviews, but also a photograph of one material object that these survivors or former camp guards had preserved. And so we have a photographic record that's very unusual. It ranges from an embroidered brassiere with Ukrainian motifs to an old-fashioned suitcase, to a notebook that a guard stole from a prisoner, as she now admits. And this material record, of course, is very incomplete, but I think it's fascinating because it's deeply embedded in these very personal stories, and it doesn't capture the bodily experience of being a prisoner, but it tells us something about what happens when you leave the Gulag. This is what you carry with you. It might be an important souvenir, it might have a memory tied to it, it might be something practical that you think you're going to use as you try and reconstruct your life. So more visual material out there that we can use as a window on the lived experience of the Gulag and the life after. So just to tie this up, I want to go back to this monument that is being created. So I had the pleasure of sorting through 300 plus entries, design entries that were submitted by amateurs and professionals for this contest. And I can tell you that there was great difficulty in trying to find a visual language to commemorate the Gulag. I've looked at an earlier competition that took place in 1989 that was very different in some ways, but also had a poverty of visual language. In 2015, the designs for the most part relied either on very abstract modern imagery or on religious symbolism, albeit usually with a coil of barbed wire thrown in to get the camp theme in there. In terms of actually visualizing the Gulag, there were only 2 tropes that stood out. One was the everyman Zek a male figure always in a padded jacket, the hat with the ear flaps, really the Ivan Denisovich from literature brought to life, and the watchtower. And it was interesting to see a watchtower in Aiden's slide because it looks exactly the same, except for there's more snow, in the Russian version. The majority of the monument entries focus not on the experience of the Gulag, but on two moments, arrest and the grave. And I like to think of these as the bookends to the Gulag. And in a way, they're not unappropriate because the audience for this monument are the loved ones, the survivors, the descendants. And they remember the moment of parting and the absence of the grave. And they also often don't know what happened in those missing years. But that said, I think it creates a problematic monument because it doesn't delve into issues of causality. There are just victims for whom we feel infinite sorrow, but there's no perpetrators, there's no ideology, and there's no mechanisms of repression. So as we look at this monument that's going to open, we're missing the history. We're going to need history books to go along with it. And it's very unfortunate. Initially, they had talked about having a memorial complex and interpretive materials, but that disappeared almost immediately. I think because it's too controversial, whereas a monument that evokes sadness and the monument that's going to be built is called the Wall of Sorrow, is a less controversial way to reincorporate this tragic history into present-day Russia. So, thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to dispense with my own remarks in the interest of starting a discussion, but I just want to make two brief points that sort of have not yet fully been made to kind of wrap things up here. As David Shearer pointed out, the two major themes of this collection are, one, to go beyond this notion of an archipelago, and two, to have this open up this comparison. One way that the archipelago metaphor, which Solzhenitsyn invented in part because of the first model camp for the entire Gulag was the Silouette Ski Camp, which was literally in an archipelago in the far north. One reason it's a little misleading is that there were so many different types of camps in the heartland of the Soviet Union. If you look at Golfo's map in her new book, there's a real concentration around Moscow. One camp that I came across looking at Smolensk Oblast was actually in the mid-30s to build this high-priority Minsk-Moscow highway. It literally moved across Smolensk as it was building the highway, and its prisoners had contact with the local population, and yet it was still considered a camp. So that gets back to the very first notion that Golfo raised. We need more studies of the vast diversity of camps. To turn to the comparative aspect, many things have been said here, but there is one distinctive feature of the Gulag that Wilson Bell's chapter brings out in this book, and that is that the Gulag, unlike so many mass atrocities in history, was not triggered by war. It was not like the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust, or the extermination camps of the Holocaust. It doesn't fit into Giorgio Agamben's fashionable description of concentration camps as extra-legal states of exception, because it was a regular part of the Soviet legal system, and it was created in peacetime, as was the Great Terror took place in peace. Of course, it was in the expectation of war that it was created, and also in the midst of a kind of ersatz war against class enemies, against political and ideological enemies, a war to create socialism. So war was present, and as Aiden's work shows, it was, the Boer War may have triggered the birth of the concentration camp, but it was then built on long-standing practices that had been going on throughout the 19th century. So war is, maybe this state of exception is problematic to begin with, but I think there's something there that this massive system was triggered not by some sort of emergency, but as a regular part of the penal system in peacetime. So I want to thank all the authors who have spoken, and I want to open it up to question and answers. We have a mic here.
I
You can speak just a
Yes.
minute.
I'm Mila Fedorova. I'm professor of literature at Georgetown. And thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I teach a course on literature of exile in prison. And for me, it was shocking that my course started as a 20th century literature course. But then I realized that each of the writers had some prison experience, Gulag experience, almost all of them. And many of the themes you mentioned today are recurring motifs of our course. Transportation and wives and military in Gulag, and animals, and certification of the inmates. But the main question we grapple with in this course is ethical, and it's about the correlation of survival and preserving humanity. Remaining human, drawing a line you're not going to cross even in order to survive. And how do and is preserving humanity, does it actually facilitate survival? And most of the books say that it does. You have to remain human in order to survive in Gulag. But sometimes I have students who say it's just a literary tradition, and they idealize life. So I wonder if your historical expertise supports this idea literature gives us.
Hello? Yeah. Don't have too much to say directly, because I think this was one of Golfo's points, was that we need to get down into the nitty-gritty, or I think Steve Barnes mentioned, bring the personal back into some of these more general histories we've been writing about. But I just wanted to point on this question to another book that recently came out called Gulag Letters, edited by Emily Johnson. These are letters by, forgetting his first name, Formikov, who wrote back to his family. And it's an interesting question, because I think there's a lot of gray areas here in terms of that issue of humanity. Formikov was at least according to Johnson's introductions, it seems likely he was an informant within the Gulag. He also worked in the cultural educational section for much of the time and had fairly plush positions. He helped cut bread for inmates, which helped get better food and so on. But still, I think for him, survival was a matter of preserving his humanity, and that was through the connection to his family. He was sending these letters back both through legal means, so some of them were censored letters, and also he had illegal means of sending these letters. But I bring that up because I think there were so many gray areas in the camp system, right? And reading the book, you kind of sympathize with him as a prisoner of the Gulag, but then he was also, it puts the reader in an interesting position too, because he was also in this position of being a kind of privileged prisoner.
Also, I know you have things
I
to say
do
about
have things to say
inhumanity.
on this.
I was going to say that inhumanity is part of humanity in a way, and we had this debate about the two contributions about Gulag medicine, and that some of the doctors did act to save people in acts of humanity, but as Golf also shows, they were extraordinarily constrained by the system and also acted as its agents. So there was both elements.
Yeah. I think this is such an interesting question, because I think a lot of prisoners don't talk about moral compromises that they make. If we can go back to Jacques Rossi and the book that will be coming out, Jacques at one point in his memoir says, this is when he was working as a spy, Soviet spy in Europe, and one of his comrades mentioned that he thought the Gulag was just a slave labor, and all this stuff about rehabilitation was just a bunch of crap. And Jacques told on him. Later, this man is arrested, and Jacques says to himself, "Oh, it wasn't because of me. It was, I'm sure, it had nothing to do with me." And then later in the camp, he says, "I never compromised myself. I never did." Other people informed, other people. I've never read the memoir of a woman who says, I gave up my body in order to get extra food. So, I mean, you know that people made these compromises. You know they did. They don't talk about it. It's very painful to talk about.
One comment.
All right, and then we'll take another question.
I
So
think,
prepare yourself.
I think you also have to keep in mind the different populations of the camp, because the morality of, say, the political prisoners may have been very different than the morality of the criminal class that was there. And humanity, from what I read of the criminals that ran some of the camps, meant very little to them. So I think, and I don't know if they're not really writing letters home, but again, I think you have to break down who you're talking about.
Other questions, please. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, I'm Randy Sim. The Gulag obviously had a very large population and was composed of different elements. But I have this image that a large part of its population was just a group that was there to fulfill somebody's quota of getting people into the Gulag. Is that an accurate impression?
One of the contributions in here is about the scientists who worked in these special sharashki, as they were called, these laboratories that are geared for engineering and scientific projects of great practical significance, and they reappeared at 3 distinct points within the Stalin period. And Azif Sadiki, who wrote the chapter, points out that sometimes they sort of quote-unquote recruited scientists by simply arresting them because they needed people with their specialties. So that's one example. Who else wants to add to this? In terms of the Great Terror, of course, there were quotas to be met, right, and they were, on the Stalinist system, you didn't want to under-fulfill your quota, you over-fulfilled it. So people got swept up in these dragnets just because they didn't have their documents. Evgenia Ginsburg's memoirs springs to mind, where one peasant woman who had been arrested as a Trotskyist didn't know what the word Trotskyism meant and thought she'd been arrested as a tractorist, which was also a neologism. So does anyone else want to speak to this question?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I think, too, I mean, there's plenty of evidence that Gulag officials, many Gulag officials anyway, were unprepared for the influx of prisoners into certain camps in certain regions and struggled to deal with it, especially during the dekulakization campaigns and then during the terror years of 37, 38. So if these were populated due to quotas, it wasn't coordinated very well. I'll just put it that way. But there definitely were arrest quotas at certain times. So it's a complicated question.
Other questions? Anyone else? Well.
So David, you raised the punitive versus corrective impulse behind the Gulag, and I just wonder, Steve, if you could just reflect after your thesis coming out and just where the state of the field is on that question, if there's consensus on it, or if this is still a sort of raging debate in the field. And then the second question is also, Steve, on the commemoration of the Gulag and the fate of the Perm Museum. What's the latest? Is there any other museum that explicitly deals with memories of the Gulag that has been constructed?
I'll be quick. I don't want to take a lot of time because this is not my book launch. But on the museum thing, I mean, there is a huge Moscow Gulag museum. There's been one for many years. A lot of people didn't know about it. It was pretty small. But a little over a year ago, I think that the new one opened over 9 times the exhibition space of the old one. It's located not far outside the Garden Range, so it's relatively centrally located. They're very active. I follow them on Facebook that talks about all the various activities going on at the museum. So I think we got to be careful when we think about this issue of memory not to draw too sharp of a black and white picture that somehow Russia under Putin doesn't want to think about this history. I don't think that's really the case. The Per Museum was not closed, which was a lot of the initial reports, but it was really more of a hostile takeover by local officials. There are mixed reports on whether this has impacted the content of the museum. I'm trying actually right now to find out more about whether that's really the case. Their online presence makes it look like the museum content has not changed significantly from when I last visited there. On this question of rehabilitation and things of this sort, I mean, I just have a reflection, I guess, as a book author, that it feels sometimes like your book gets reduced to a single sentence, and somehow my book was about rehabilitation, and I felt like it was about a lot more than that I tried to show the complicated aspects of that, the way that it interacted with political and economic impetuses. Maybe I didn't do that effectively enough. I think it is a very complicated question. I think a lot of these contributions have added a lot to the thinking about that question. I don't think they have to be seen as mutually exclusive. Maybe I pushed that too hard. I was really trying to make a statement in a field that was at that point still relatively new and was driven primarily by what we'd seen with Solzhenitsyn and Applebaum. So, but I think these contributions are terrific and really sort of add to what I've been trying to get us to do, which is to think about this in a much more complicated fashion.
I just wanted to jump in on the museum question for a second. So this Moscow Museum, which is a very state-of-the-art multimedia museum, and I highly recommend visiting, it is specifically directed to the history of the Gulag in the more traditional Stalin time period. I think one of the problems with Perm is that the prisoners in Perm were Brezhnev-era dissidents, and the history of the dissidents is not part of this monument project at all. And it's quite ironic that the monument will be unveiled on October 30th, which is now the day of remembrance of victims of political repression. That's a holiday that was created in 1991 when we thought there weren't going to be any more political prisoners. But that choice of the day of October 30th, political prisoners in the Brezhnev time marked that informally in camps as Day of Political Prisoner to try and get that status for themselves. So again, what was not ill-intentioned has kind of elided the dissident movement out of the history of political repression.
Sorry to keep jumping in, but I'll be brief. There are other museums too. There's one in Tomsk that was actually founded in 1989, but didn't officially open until I think 1994. So there are others. On the point of education, rehabilitation, I don't think it's dead. There's an article coming out in Critica, actually, I think soon, on soccer in the camps, and this takes seriously some of the cultural aspects. Formikov and other memoirists who, and sort of Formikov's not a memoirist, but there are a number of memoirists now. There's a memoir of a Gulag actress, the name is blanking on it, but a lot of memoirists who worked in the cultural and educational section. At the very least, they see it as a space of relative, a way to get away from the hardships of the camp. But also, some of them do seem to take seriously some of these Soviet values that, they're showing all the same Soviet films that people see outside of the camps. There's a lot of overlap there in the cultural sphere, and I don't think I don't think the debate is yet over.
At least one won the Stalin Prize, right? Lahusin's neglected classic, How Life Writes the Book.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
So we're going to take any remaining questions, because I know we want to get to the reception. So if anyone has a question after this, we'll pass the mic. We'll take them all together. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, kind of following up on the earlier quota question, to what extent do you think that the Gulag system was push versus pull? So pull meaning the need to stock forced labor and kind of to replenish the forced labor supply, and push being Stalin's own personal predilections or the repressive features of the system or whatever.
Thank you. Another question now.
Hi, so I have a question about sources that you're using when you're writing about the Gulag. So I'm currently writing my dissertation, and I have a couple of government sources about the Gulag, and it's not a huge part of my dissertation, but I'm just wondering how you read those sources, and what information you pulled, and how you kind of balance the government sources against the memoirs you were using.
Anyone else for questions? Two more.
So just in terms of moving forward with Gulag research, what kind of prospects do you see for focusing maybe more so on the Gulag experience or even just deportation experience in Central Asia? Is there a lot of space there? Is it already covered ground? I'm kind of curious.
Okay. Way in the back, Rita.
Thank you for an excellent book. I look forward to reading it. My question is about the state of what we might know with regard to individual experiences, not among the prison population, the prisoners themselves, but the people who operated the camps at any of the levels, the people who actually sustained and made the system work to a greater or lesser extent.
Okay, so we'll try to keep the answers very brief, and I just want to say we have copies of the book at 20% discount available, and flyers to take away if you don't want to buy it right now. We just want to think about it. So I don't want to do the hard sell. But on the first question, Greg Afinogiannov's question, this is really this is impossible to answer. I've grappled with it, and I'm not really the person to do that. But I think that, we have contradictory evidence because sometimes the camp directors were surprised by the amount of prisoners that were being sent to them, and they weren't capable of handling it. It was too much for them. But on the other hand, they demanded it, or one wonders whether people, there were cases of groups of people being arrested in order to fill the needs of the forced labor. And so one thing I think we can say is that between politics and economics, there was a kind of, they were joined at the hip, and that there was a kind of circular interaction between the impetus to arrest people and the need to use them for forced labor. And one big piece of that puzzle was the Soviet leaders' misunderstanding of the hidden costs of the Gulag. They were addicted to what they thought of as free labor, and we talked about this with Daniel Beer in terms of the czarist system. Many people saw the costs of that, but still they were unable to stop it and unable to fully grasp the hidden costs of the exile system that preceded it. So that's one piece of the puzzle. In terms of the last question about perpetrators, there's a great book by Debbie Capel called Gulag Boss. It's a memoir, a perpetrator memoir that gets into a lot. It's one of the only one published in English, but it's definitely worth to get into the question of the camp guards and administrators.
There is one more which I think it came out last year, Diary of a Camp Guard, Ivan Chisakov. And it's not. I think it's problematic source, but what it does show is that the guards themselves, or at least this particular guard, had profoundly miserable existences, and actually part of their harshness towards the prisoners was a sense of kind of belligerent resentment at the fact that they had to find themselves in these locations as well.
Would anyone want to? Don't forget the source question.
Okay,
versus archive.
Yeah, on the source question, I think it's very hard to just look at the government records without reading the memoirs and without looking at different kinds of government records. Because if you just, and I think this happened early in Gulag studies, we went straight to, what was Stalin saying about the camps and the people around Stalin. And that's one image. You get this image of, this well-functioning economic engine of industrialization. When you look at other records and you see something very different. So it is a little tricky. The other thing is that they omitted a lot. They didn't say a lot about death rates, about illness, about the frailty of the workforce. So there are these omissions that you have to grapple with. So that's a problem. I just want to say something about the push-pull. this is a very difficult question, and I think that the whole question of were they arresting people for labor or because they needed labor, for a long time we thought not, because Oleg Plevnyuk had said about the Great Terror, he said they shot 1 million people. If they shot 1 million people, then they're not thinking in terms of labor and preserving labor. And if they're building a system where people are growing increasingly frail and dying at massive rates, then they're not thinking about economic efficiency. On the other hand, I think that it's also true that later, with the increase of mechanization and so on, they needed less labor. And so maybe the winding down of the Gulag was really a calculation about labor productivity. And with mechanization, you need less labor, and maybe we don't need this Gulag after all. Whereas, earlier we did. So I think there's so much more research that needs to be done on this question of the relationship between the economy and forced labor. And on that front, I also think, and this gets back to slavery and the question of and convict penal labor and the question of comparison. At some point, people believed that coercion was the way to motivate workers. At some point in economic history, that notion faded, and the idea that you motivate people better in other ways started to emerge, and that's also important to this history.
I see a burning to say, keep it short. Yeah. This is going to be our last response.
Actually, it just occurred to me that in his memorandum in 1953, just after Stalin died, the Beria, the security chief, recommended to his Politburo colleagues that he was consciously aware that the Gulag was an economic burden and that it needed to be stopped for that reason. That's the reason he gave, no moral reasons. So at least that was filtering into someone's mind.
Let me echo Golfo with the perennial plaintive plea of the scholar, more research. Please thank everyone.